mo ng mga Okay, so next from the movie My Ex and Wives, starring Enrique Hill,
Hello?
3,
Hello?
go.
Hello?
Don't forget the word I okay, ha? I okay.
Pangit ako. Ulit ba ako? Come on.
Ha? Guys. Okay, so si Patricia daw. Patricia Aurelio, open your camera.
Pwede. Mic lang kay short type man gid ko gamay.
Hindi na pwede pa. Hindi na pwede pa.
Dali na pwede.
Hindi na pwede. Cam na.
Gusto mo ka ng pang Star Magics?
Oh, Star Magic daw.
Oy,
Okay,
gusto mo kon kamoy. Audio na lang with feelings.
on cam. Naman there you know, players must be turned on their camera.
Three, two, one, go.
Lights, camera,
Bako?
action.
Pangit ba ako? Kapalit-palit ba ako? Then why?
Oh, Be, tama ba to, Be? Next slide. Okay, so tama siya. Yeah. Again daw, again. Oh, gakatawad daw. Again daw, again. Joke lang. So next na tad, next. Next is from the teleserye Tubig at Langis. So, 1, 2, 3, go! Hmm, wala mo kuan, wala mo ah. Wala na madlok na sila sa on cam ay. Plus points from sir daw ang prize. Pwede sir. Sir ba?
Hmm. Pag tiyarang
O
performance.
daw,
Ay.
yan.
So, pwede na to ako, sir?
Og 5 po daw. 5 pesos per acting. Wala yung mga. Guys. Lagi mo ah. Sure na? Di na mangyo. Sure na good? Sure na? Sure na? Oh. Next, next, next. Next, next. Ay, okay. Next slide. Oh, kani. From the movie Barcelona by Daniel Padilla and Catherine Bernardo. Oh. 1, 2, 3, go. Kung wala daw mo akay, mag-spin the wheel me. Oh, si Venus daw. Venus. Open your camera. Oh, sige hangyo, pwede ra off cam. Guys.
Ako.
Oo, ikaw. Ikaw.
Hindi ako si Celine, and you will never be Celine.
Yay! Next slide. Wow, pwede na ba? Pwede na mapuli kang Catherine ba? So next line. From the movie One More Try. So 1, 2, 3, go. Tingnan ko, lisod siya.
Pasensya to. Go, JM.
So, Jan Michael, lights, camera, action.
Wait lang, mag-on ka. Ay, mag-on ka. Wait sa. Yes, the light mo to. Wait sa ha.
Sure.
Mag-on ka. Okay. Okay. Balik, Claire.
Sige, lights, camera, action.
Ang pera natin, hindi basta-basta nauubos. Pero ang pasensya ko, masing konti na lang.
Ah. Thank you. Thank you, JM. So, next daw, So, tama ito yung gingon. Pwede na ba? Next line. From the movie Bata Bata, Paano Ka Ginawa? Giingon ni siya ni Carlo Aquino. So, 1, 2, 3, go! Ay, okay. So, Regina? Ready na ba?
Hello?
Hi, Reg.
Hello?
Lights, camera,
Hindi ko sure sige.
action.
Akala mo lang wala. Pero meron! Tolo ba? Hindi ka meron?
Wow. So, kung tanaon kung tama ba to? Oo, tama. Na kay 5 Reg and plus points from Sir. Next, from the teleserye Pangako Sa'yo, Daniel Padilla and Catherine Bernardo Gapon. Pero giingon ni siya ni, sige, kanina nga bae. Sa taas. Judith Santa Maria. So, 1, 2, 3, go!
Ano yun? Ang bangis ng isa.
Ay, basta? Sure na, wala? Mag-look, oh. First word. Ay, Richard daw, Richard. Be, pakitai ko, be, pahinasi ko acting skills na to, dira.
Wait. Matitikman nyo.
Lights.
Ay, okay. Sorry.
Lights,
Again.
camera, action.
Matitikman nyo ang batas ng isang ape.
Oh, wow, aping-api. So, be, kung tama ba to? Next. So, correct. So, another 5 pesos. From the movie Between Walang Ningning by Sharon Cuneta and others. 1, 2, 3, go! Sikat kayo ni siyang line. Ay, Madsir. Oo, tama. Yes. So, si Bonbon na po daw. Grabe, boy. Wow. Okay, Bon, ikaw, Bon.
Okay, sige, go. Sige, Claire.
Open cam, Gapon.
Yag.
Open cam.
Okay. Wait sa. Nag-open na ba akong cam?
Lights, camera, action.
You're nothing but a second rate, trying hard, copycat.
Wow. Pun murag sideline mo pag-artista, no? Then next line daw, kung tama ba to? Yes. Hapot award naman, bumbay, give chance to others daw. So, you're na. Next line, please. From the movie A Very Special Love by Sarah Geronimo and Jen Lloyd. So, 1, 2, 3, go! Sure na, wala? Wala. Ano ulit?
Isiwan lang.
Oh, bonbon na po daw. Wala. Okay, Bon, ikaw may nakauna. So, ikaw mo ang
Okay.
na po.
Wait sa, pagpapilabog ka.
Open ka gyapon.
Sorry guys, namugas ko. Sige, Claire, go.
Lights, camera, action.
I said, lock the door before you leave.
Next. Sabi na to. I said, oh, grabe ba yun? Naman na. Si Bonbon na yung best actor there. So, next slide please. Or Mara man to. Thank you, guys. Ay, napada isa. One. Sir, pwede daw ka mapil, sir. Pang last daw, sir. Sir.
Sige.
Sir.
Sige. Sige ka.
Ikaw daw, ani, sir. Lights, camera, action.
I need an explanation. I need an acceptable reason.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Next slide, please.
Ay, naspons
Wala
mo
lang,
tanan. Ay,
hindi ng
joke.
all. Ay, dili na mo, sir. Uli na, miss, sir. Plus 5 sa Ebal do, sir. Oh, plus 5.
Recorded to tanan, guys.
So, more on that. Then, dagan the actress din ba yung actor. Thank you.
Classic and proceed na.
So, good afternoon guys. So, dagan gyud ko actors ug actresses sa kuan, Axie. So nga discover na gyud, naka-workshop dito sa Star Magic. So, kay mo naman tong icebreaker. So, thank you sa tanan nag-participate. So, mag-proceed na ta sa among reporting. So, our topic is all about fraud schemes and fraud detection. So, I'll be the first reporter. I am Ambassador S. Doler, and I'll be talking about more on fraud and accountant. So, next, please. There. Next. So, the possibility of fraud remains one of the most significant risks that organizations confront, di ba? Okay, when fraud is discovered, whether it is done by a single employee, a group of employees, top management, or a third party, the afflicted company may suffer not only huge financial losses but also significant reputational harm. Mo di ba natong kadunggan sa mga news nga kanang usually mga business kay kanang tungod kay na fraud yung nahitabo and all, so dako gid siya nga damage. And fraud is not confined to a single country or industry. It can occur at any time in practically any organization. So large accounting scandals in the United States, for example, Enron, katong WorldCom, which is very familiar sa atua, were front page news around the world at the turn of the 21st century. So di ba kay despite the fact na ang term nga fraud kay commonly used og kadunggan na nato sa bisag ahalang gid nga financial news, kay its definition pagapon kay apparent. Kay for example, suspected fraud is frequently in the outcome of poor management decisions or adverse business conditions in bankruptcies and corporate failures. In these circumstances, it is critical to identify and comprehend the nature and meaning of fraud. So, ang meaning there's a fraud is it is a false representation of a material fact made by one party to another party with the intent to deceive and induce the other party to justifiably rely on the fact to his or her detriment. So next, please. So according to common law, A fraudulent act must meet the following 5 conditions. So, na 5 conditions. First is ang false representation. So, false representation, there must be a false statement or a non-disclosure. So, second is material fact. So, na dapat material fact. So, a fact must be substantial factor in inducing someone to act. Third is dapat na ay intent. So there must be the intent to deceive or the knowledge that one statement is false. So fourth is dapat na justifiable reliance. So the misrepresentation must have been a substantial factor on which the injured party relied. And fifth is injury or loss. So the deception must have caused injury or loss to the victim of the fraud. So muna ang 5 following conditions. So next, please. So fraud in the business environment. So it is an intentional deception, misappropriation of a company's asset or manipulation of its financial data to the advantage of the perpetrator. So in accounting literature, fraud is also commonly known as white-collar crime, defalcation, embezzlement, and irregularity. So one other term or sa fraud. And auditors encounter fraud at 2 levels. So employee fraud and management fraud. So ato na silang i-differentiate o ato na silang tunan. So next please. So 2 levels of fraud. So naatay employee fraud. So kani employee fraud is generally designed to directly convert cash or other assets to the employee's personal benefit. So typically, the employee circumvents the company's internal control system for personal gain. So employee fraud or fraud by non-management employees, so muna ay ang other term pod. So if a company has an effective system of internal control, defalcations or embezzlements can usually be prevented or detected. So nato naman taning internal control more on sa katong, di ba, sa atong other subject. And we also have management fraud. So management fraud is more insidious than employee fraud because it often escapes detection until the organization has suffered irreparable damage or loss. So usually management fraud does not involve the direct theft of assets. So top management may engage in fraudulent practices in order to boost the company's stock price. So mga common ginato nga kakaibalaan. This could be done to meet investors' expectation or to benefit from stock options included in the manager's compensation plan. So this is referred to as performance fraud by the Commission on Audit Responsibilities, and it typically involves misleading techniques to exaggerate earnings or avoid the recognition of insolvency or a drop in earnings. Lower level management fraud often entails deliberately misrepresenting financial data and internal reports in order to obtain greater salary, a promotion, or avoid the consequences of poor performance. So let's learn more about employee fraud. So next, please. So employee fraud usually involves 3 steps. So remember this. First is stealing something of value or an asset. Second is converting the asset to a usable form or cash. Third is concealing the crime to avoid detection. So next, please. So now, let us learn more about the management fraud. So management fraud typically contains 3 special characteristics. So first is the fraud is perpetrated at levels of management above the one to which internal control structure generally relate. Second is the fraud frequently involves using financial statements to create an illusion that an entity is healthier and more prosperous than in fact it is. Third is if the fraud involves misappropriation of assets, it frequently is shrouded in a maze of complex business transactions, often involving related third parties. So kaning mga characteristics of management fraud, nag-indicate niya that management can frequently commit irregularities by circumventing an otherwise effective internal control structure that would prevent lower level employees from committing similar irregularities. So next, please. So I believe kanipod familiar na pud kita ani kay natakol na pud nato sa atong operations auditing. So the fraud triangle. So Cressey's fraud triangle is a critical conceptual framework for understanding fraud. It is loosely based on what police officers and detectives have referred to as means, motives, and opportunity. The fraud triangle was developed by a sociologist, Donald Cressey, and has been widely disseminated by the ACFE. It consists of three components. So many three components. So first is ang situational pressure, or the perceived need or pressure. Second is the opportunity, or the perceived opportunity. And third is ethics, or the rationalization of fraudulent behavior. So the three factors that contribute to or are associated with management and employee fraud are first, on situational pressure. So also many situational pressure. So it includes personal or job-related stresses that could coerce an individual to act dishonestly. Second is the opportunity, which involves direct access to assets and or access to information that control assets. And last is ethics, which pertains to one's character and degree of moral opposition to acts of dishonesty. So the fraud triangle highlights the three elements that may be called the root causes of fraud. So fraud perpetrators want to relieve real or perceived pressure. For example, let's say generating the attitude that when you can't make the numbers, you just make it up or make up the numbers. So they need to see ample opportunity also so that they can carry out the fraud with ease. For example, nobody's watching the store, so the employee is trusted and completely and unlikely to get caught. And last and most importantly is that they need to rationalize their action as acceptable. For example, parang, I'm doing it for the good of the company. Anak. So next, please. So here you see an illustration about the fraud triangle. So the figure graphically depicts the interplay among the three factors. So the figure suggests that an individual with a high level of personal ethics who is confronted by a low pressure and limited opportunity to commit fraud is more likely to behave honestly than one with weaker personal ethics, who is under high pressure and exposed to greater fraud opportunities. So next, please. So according to forensic experts and academics, when the fraud triangle factors are considered, the auditor's evaluation of fraud is enhanced. So clearly, ethical and personal stress-related issues do not lend themselves to easy observation and analysis. To shed light on these factors, auditors frequently employ a red flag checklist that includes the following types of questions. So, red flag checklist. So first is we have, do key executives have unusually high personal debt? Or do key executives appear to be living beyond their means? Third is, do key executives engage in habitual gambling? Or do key executives appear to abuse alcohol or drugs? Do any other key executives appear to lack personal codes of ethics? Or are economic conditions unfavorable within the company's industry? Or does the company use several different banks, none of which sees the company's entire financial picture? Or do any key executives have close associations with suppliers? Another is also, is the company experiencing a rapid turnover of key employees, either through resignation or termination? And last is, do one or two individuals dominate the company? So a review of several of the issues that contemporary auditors may be required to retain professional investigative firms. So investigative firms to conduct confidential background checks on key executives of existing and prospective client firms. So next, please. So now let's talk about financial losses from fraud. So a research study published by the Association of the Certified Fraud Examiners, or the ACFE, in 2008 estimates losses from fraud and abuse to be 7% of annual revenues. So next. So the actual cost of fraud is, however, difficult to quantify for a number of reasons. So may mga reason nga di quantify actual cost of fraud. So first is, not all fraud is detected. Second is that Of that detected, not all is reported. Third, in many fraud cases, incomplete information is gathered. Fourth, information is not properly distributed to management or law enforcement authorities. And last, is too often, business organizations decide to take no civil or criminal action against the perpetrator or perpetrators of the fraud. So along with the direct economic loss to the organization, indirect costs such as decreased productivity, legal fees, increased unemployment, and business disruption caused by the fraud investigation must be considered. So next, please. The perpetrators of fraud. So the ACFE study examined a number of factors that profile the perpetrators of the frauds, including position within the organization, collusion with others, gender, age, and education. So next, please. So here we see the fraud losses, the summary of the fraud losses by position within the organization. So the table shows that 40% of the reported fraud cases were committed by non-managerial employees, 37% by managers, and 23% by executives or the owners. Although the reported number of frauds perpetrated by employees is higher than that of managers and almost twice that of executives, the average losses per category are inversely related, as illustrated here. So that would all be for my report. And Janica.
A joke. Hello. Okay, so now we have the fraud losses and collusion effect. So collusion among employees in the commission of a fraud is difficult to both prevent and detect. So this is particularly true when the collusion is between managers and their subordinate employees. When they participate in fraud with the employees over whom they are supposed to provide oversight, the organization's control structure is weakened or completely circumvented, and the company becomes more vulnerable to losses. So this table compares the median losses from frauds committed by individuals acting alone and frauds involving collusion. This includes both internal collusion and schemes in which an employee or manager colludes with an outsider, such as a vendor or a customer. Although frauds involving collusion are less common, the median loss is $500,000 as compared to $115,500 for frauds perpetrated by individuals' work. Now we have the fraud losses by gender. So this table shows that the median fraud loss per case caused by males is $250, and it is more than twice that caused by females, which is $110. Now we have the fraud losses by age. So this table indicates that perpetrators younger than 26 years of age caused median losses of $25,000, while frauds perpetrated by individuals 60 years of age and older were approximately 20 times larger. Now we have the fraud losses by education. This table shows the median loss from frauds relative to the perpetrator's education level. Frauds committed by high school graduates average only $100,000, whereas those with bachelor's degrees average $210, and perpetrators with advanced degrees were responsible for frauds with a median loss of $550. So, in conclusion, upon closer examination, a common thread appears. Notwithstanding the importance of personal ethics and situational pressures in inducing one to commit fraud, opportunity is the factor that actually facilitates the act. So, no matter how unethical an individual is, they cannot perpetrate a fraud if there is no opportunity, 'di ba? And indeed, the opportunity factor explains much of the financial loss differential in each of the demographic categories presented in the study. So, with regards to the position, individuals in the highest positions within an organizations are beyond the internal control structure and have the greatest access to company funds and assets. In terms naman of gender, women are not fundamentally more honest than men, but men occupy high corporate positions in greater numbers than women. This affords men greater access to assets. In terms naman of age, older employees tend to occupy higher ranking positions and therefore generally have a greater access to company assets. Next, we have in terms of education, those with more education occupy higher positions in their organization and therefore have greater access to company funds and other assets. In conclusion, one reason for segregating occupational duties is to deny potential perpetrators the opportunity they need to commit fraud. When individuals in critical positions collude, they create opportunities to control or gain access to assets that otherwise would not exist. So now we have the fraud schemes. Fraud schemes can be classified in a number of different ways. And there are three broad categories of fraud schemes. This is the fraudulent statements, corruption, asset misappropriation, and computer fraud. Computer fraud is not considered as a broad category because ang tumong niya kay same lang sa asset misappropriation. First, we have the fraudulent statements. So fraudulent statements are associated with management fraud, whereas all fraud involves some form of financial misstatement. To meet the definition under this class of fraud scheme, the statement itself must bring direct or indirect financial benefit to the perpetrator. In other words, the statement is not simply a vehicle for obscuring or covering a fraudulent act. So to understand this, for example, misstating the cash account balance to cover the theft of cash is not financial statement fraud. Also, pag i-understate nimo ang liabilities to present a more favorable financial picture of the organization to drive up stock prices thus fall under this classification. This table shows that whereas fraudulent statements account for only 10% of the fraud cases covered in the study, the median loss due to this type of fraud scheme is significantly higher than losses from corruption and asset misappropriation. So the series of events symbolized by the Enron, WorldCom, debacles caused many to question whether our existing federal securities laws were adequate to ensure full and fair financial disclosures by public companies. So these are the following underlying problems that is concerned by the many. First is the lack of auditor independence. So auditing firms that are also engaged by their clients to perform non-accounting activities such as actuarial services, mga internal audit outsourcing services, and consulting lack independence. The firms are essentially auditing their own work. The risk is that as auditors, they will not bring to management's attention detected problems that may adversely affect their consulting fees. So for example, ang auditor sa Enron kay both internal auditor and management consultant. So di siya pwede. Next, we have the lack of director independence. Many board of directors are composed of individuals who are not independent. Examples of lack of independence are directors who have a personal relationship by serving on the boards of other directors' companies, have a business trading relationship as key customers or suppliers of the company, either have a financial relationship as primary stockholders, or have received personal loans from the company. So, whereas it is neither practical nor wise to establish a board of directors that is totally void of self-interest, popular wisdom suggests that a healthier board of directors is one in which the majority of directors are independent outsiders with the integrity and the qualifications to understand the company and objectively plan its course. Third is the questionable executive compensation schemes. So excessive use of short-term stock options to compensate directors and executives may result in short-term thinking and strategies aimed at driving up stock prices at the expense of the firm's long-term health. In extreme cases, financial statement misrepresentation has been the vehicle to achieve the stock price needed to exercise the option. And lastly is the inappropriate accounting practices. The use of inappropriate accounting techniques is a characteristic common to many financial statement fraud schemes. Enron made elaborate use of special purpose entities to hide liabilities through off balance sheet accounting. SPEs are legal. The SPEs, special purpose entities, are legal, but their application in this case was clearly intended to deceive the market. Enron also employed income inflating techniques. For example, when the company sold a contract to provide natural gas for a period of 2 years, they would recognize all the future revenue in the period when the contract was sold. So that ends my report.
So, hello guys. Since some of the significant corporate governance failures have been discussed by the previous reporter, here is one of the legislation designed to remedy them, the famously known Sarbanes-Oxley Act. So the Congress enacted the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and fraud into law in July 2002 to address plummeting institutional and individual investor confidence triggered in part by business failures and accounting restatement due to fraud. So this act establishes a framework to modernize and reform the oversight and regulation of public company auditing. So its principal reforms pertain to the following. Next slide, please. First is the creation of an accounting oversight board. So the SOX created the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, or the PCAOB, to set auditing, quality control, and ethics standards, to inspect registered accounting firms, to conduct investigation, and to take disciplinary actions. Next slide, please. The Act addresses auditors by creating more separation between a firm's attestations and non-auditing activities. So this is intended to specify categories of services that a public accounting firm cannot perform for its client, such as bookkeeping or other services related to the accounting records or financial statements and financial information system design and implementation, and any other services that the PCAOB determines it permissible. Although the SOX prohibits those auditors from providing those services I mentioned to their audit clients, they are not prohibited from performing such services for non-audit clients or for privately held companies. The third one is for the corporate governance and responsibility. The Act requires all audit committee members to be independent and requires the audit committee to hire and oversee the external auditor. So this provision is consistent with many investors who considers the board composition to be critical investment factor. For example, a Thomson Financial survey revealed that most institutional investors want corporate boards to be composed of at least 75% independent directors. So next slide, please. Issuer and management disclosure. So the SOX imposes new corporate disclosure requirements. So this includes first, public companies must report all of balance sheet transactions. Second is annual reports filed with the SEC must include a statement by management asserting that it is responsible for creating and maintaining adequate internal controls and asserting to the effectiveness of those controls. Third is the officer must certify that the company's accounts fairly present the firm's financial conditions and results of operation. And knowingly filing a false certification is a criminal offense. And lastly, the Sarbanes-Oxley imposes a range of new criminal penalties for fraud and other wrongful acts. In particular, the Act creates new federal crimes relating to the destruction of documents or audit paperwork, securities fraud, tampering with documents to the used in the official proceeding, and actions against whistleblowers. So, next slide, please. Another broad category of fraud scheme is the corruption. So what is corruption? Corruption involves an executive, manager, or employee of the organization in collusion with an outsider. So corruption accounts for about 10% of the occupational fraud cases. So the Association of Certified Fraud Examiner, or the ACFA study, identifies four principal types of corruption: the bribery, illegal gratuities, conflicts of interest, and economic extortion. So first, what is bribery? Bribery. Next slide, please. Bribery involves giving, offering, soliciting, or receiving things of value to influence an official in the performance of his or her lawful duties. So the bribery defrauds the entity of the right to honest and loyal services from those employed by it. For example, the manager of a meat packing company offers a U.S. health inspector a cash payment. So in return, the inspector suppresses his report of health violation discovered during a routine inspection of the meat packing facilities. And in this situation, the victim are those who rely on the inspector's honest reporting. So the loss here is the salary paid to the inspector for not performing his job correctly, and any damages that may result from failure to perform. The second principal type is the illegal gratuity. An illegal gratuity involves giving, receiving, offering, or soliciting something of value because of an official act that has been done. So this is similar to a bribe, but the transaction occurs after the fact. So, for example, the plant manager in a corporation uses his influence to ensure that request for proposal is written in such way that only one constructor will be able to submit a satisfactory bid. So as a result, the favored constructor's proposal is accepted at a non-competitive price. In return, the contractor secretly makes a financial payment to the plant manager. So the victims in this case are those who expect a competitive procurement process. So the loss is that the company incurs because of the non-competitive pricing of the construction. Next. Next is the conflict of interest. A conflict of interest occurs when an employee acts on behalf during the discharge of his or her duties, or has a self-interest in the activity being performed. So when the employee's conflict of interest is unknown to the employer and results in a financial loss, then fraud has occurred. So ato ako mga examples nga gipang-ingon ganiha is example siya sa conflicts of interest. And lastly is the next slide please. And lastly is the economic economic extortion. It is the use or threat of force, including economic sanction, by an individual or organization to obtain something of value. So, for example, a contract procurement agent for a state government threatens to blacklist a highly contractor if he does not make a financial payment to the agent. So, if the contractor fails to cooperate, the blacklisting will effectively eliminate him from consideration of future work. So, next slide, please. So, asset misappropriation is the last broad category of fraud scheme identified by the ACFA, wherein the most common fraud schemes involve some form of asset misappropriation in which assets are either directly or indirectly diverted to the perpetrator's benefits. And 90% of the frauds included in the ACFA study fall into this category. So, next slide, please. So the table shows the percent of occurrence and the median value of the fraud losses in 8 subcategories of asset appropriation. Next slide, please. So these are the 8 subcategory of asset misappropriation. First is the scheming. So scheming involves stealing cash from an organization before it is recorded on the organization's books and records. So one example of scheming is an employee who accepts payments from a customer but does not record the sale. So this type of fraud may continue for several weeks or months until detected. It will only be detected when the customer complains that his account has not been credited. So the second one is the cash larceny. It involves schemes where cash receipts are stolen from organization after they have been recorded in the organization books and records. So an example of this is the lapping. So where the cash receipts clerk first steals and cashes a checks from customer A to conceal the accounting imbalance caused by the loss of the asset. Customer's A's account is not credited. Later, or to the next billing period, the employees uses a check received from customer B and apply it to the customer's A's account. The funds received in the next period from customer C are then applied to the account of the customer B and so on and so on. So, wala siya lapping. Next slide, please. Billing to the billing schemes. So it is perpetrated by employers who causes their employer to issue a payment to a false suppliers or vendor by submitting an invoices for fictitious goods or services or etc. Um, the fourth one is the check tampering. Check tampering involves forging or changing in some material way a check that the organization has written to a legitimate payee. So one example of this is an employee who steals an outgoing checks to a vendor, forges the payee signature, and cashes the check. So next slide, please. The fifth one is the payroll fraud. So this is the distribution of fraudulent paychecks to existent or non-existent employees. For example, a supervisor keeps an employee on the payroll who has left the organization. So each week, the supervisor continues to submit time cards to the payroll department as if the employee were still working for the victim, still working. So this type of fraud often involves collusion between the supervisor and the timekeeper. Next is the expense reimbursement. Expense reimbursement frauds are schemes in which an employee makes a claim for reimbursement of fictitious or inflated business expenses. For example, a company salesman files false expense report claiming meals, lodging, and travel that never occurred. So, seven is the theft of cash. This scheme that involved the direct theft of cash on hand in the organization. So understandable naman siya. And the last one is the last category of asset misappropriation is the non-cash misappropriation. So the non-cash fraud schemes involve the theft or misuse of the victim's organization non-cash assets. So one example of this is the warehouse clerk who steals inventory from a warehouse or storeroom. Another example is a customer service clerk who sells confidential customer information to a third party. So that would be all for my report. Thank you, guys.
Let's take a pause there. I want to ask the reporters this question. Kanina ang good na kay it was mentioned na there are example age or your position in the in the company mo ay naghahatag og opportunity nas to commit fraud. So my question would be, does having a CIS environment, and now that the environment is computerized na sa most companies, does it provide greater opportunity for fraud or does it lessen fraud? So I just want to hear your opinion. Anyone from the group? Or,
Again, sir?
does having a CIS environment or a computerized uh, environment provide greater opportunity for fraud or does it lessen the opportunity? Why or why not?
Sir, good afternoon, sir.
For me po, sir, kay, I think kanang dili siya substantially kales ang kaning fraud po, sir, kay although galahi na ang iyang way sa pag-record po sa information system, kay kuan siya, sir, lahi na po ang iyang ang nahitabo, sir, kay lahi na bitaw ang way nga mahitabo ang fraud. Like dili siya mawala, sir, pero kanang nalahi na ang way kay nanamantay kaning computer, kay gayus na computer, so galahi na ang kanang murag ang ginabuhat sa kaning perpetrators po, sir, para may tabo ang fraud.
Okay.
That's my opinion po, sir.
Okay. I think that's valid na. Because according mo po dito sa fraud triangle, kay wala man dito ang technology or ang method to commit more on the pressure, opportunity, and the ethics. So, pero it's also good, na ko nabasahan na there's also na fraud square and fraud pentagon, in which there are 5 na kuan ga exist to nga mga reasons to commit fraud or mga underlying factors in committing fraud. So okay. And okay, I just wanna emphasize dito na sa kuan some experience I have with regards, especially kanina sa payroll na katong na ay mga employees na wala di ay so ang tawagan na kay mga ghost employees. And one thing that we do in while auditing kay we really need to check sila, example, we check their payroll for the expenses. So dili lang ang data silang salary ang among gina-check, dili lang kung ni match ba ang computation sa iyang, example, sa iyang DTR padulong sa accounting records, but we also check with the HR department the existence or mismo ang ang data on those employees. So the challenge but is that these companies man kay confidential ning mga data, especially with their managers and directors, those in the higher position. So magduha-duha sila og hatag sa information. So I think that's a challenge na for the auditors na how do you convince no part sa atong kanang pag-convince sa atong client that this data is important and that also this data will be confidential good and will only be used for this audit. So I think isa siya ka importante in auditing. So especially kini pong sa payroll nga part ang isa sa nakitaan or one of my experience in wherein fraud can be mabuhat gid ang fraud. Okay. So sige, let's continue.
So good afternoon, everyone. I am Charem Mesabgao, and we are now down to the last fraud scheme, computer fraud. So the topic of computer fraud is of special importance to auditors because computers lie at the heart of most organizations' accounting information systems today. So as mentioned by Ms. Janica, the objectives of the computer fraud are the same with misappropriation of assets. However, the techniques used to commit computer fraud varied greatly. So mao na siya ang atoang i-focus karon. So next please. So for the purpose of this discussion, computer fraud includes the following: the theft, misuse, or misappropriation of assets by altering computer-readable records and files. The theft, misuse, or misappropriation of assets by altering the logic of computer software. The theft or illegal use of computer-readable information. So next slide, please. So also, the computer fraud includes the theft, corruption, illegal copying, or intentional destruction of computer software. And lastly, the theft, misuse, or misappropriation of computer hardware. So those are the computer fraud. Next, please. So to better understand computer fraud, let us first look into this model. So this is the general model for accounting information systems. So presented here It portrays conceptually the key stages of an information system. So as observed, the system starts with data collection. In this stage, data are collected from internal and external sources. And after that, after the collection of the data processing and the data management. And from the processing, data are generated and distributed to internal and external end users. So with the information generated, feedback are given and will form part of the internal and external sources of data. So note that each stage in the model, data collection, data processing, database management, and information generation, is a potential area of risk for certain types of computer fraud. And my discussion will focus on these stages and the certain types of computer fraud related to these stages. So next, please. Next slide, please, Jan. Okay. So the first stage of the information system, data collection. It is the first operational stage in the information system. Its objective is to ensure that transaction data entering the system are valid, complete, and free from material errors. So in many respects, this is the most important stage in the system because transaction errors pass through the data collection undetected, the organization runs the risk that the system will process the erroneous data and that they will impact the financial statements. So there are two rules that govern the design of data collection procedures, relevance and efficiency. So relevance, the information system should capture only relevant data. Only data that ultimately contribute to information are relevant. So the data collection stage should be designed to filter irrelevant facts from the system. Efficiency. So efficient data collection procedures are designed to collect data only once. So this data can then be made available to multiple users. Capturing the same data more than once leads to data redundancy and inconsistency, which can result in inappropriate actions and bad decisions. So the simplest way to perpetrate a computer fraud is at the data collection or data entry stage because frauds of this type require little or no computer skills. So the perpetrator need only understand the system and its control weaknesses. So the fraudulent act involves entering falsified data into the system. So this may involve deleting, altering, or creating a transaction. So for example, karon na mention nga payroll fraud. So the perpetrator may insert a fraudulent payroll transaction along with other legitimate transactions. So unless the insertion is detected by internal controls, then the system will generate an additional paycheck for the perpetrator, which may result to the overstatement of expenses and the understatement of net income. So that would be the computer fraud data collection. So next, please. So these are the examples of fraud related to data collection. So masquerading, piggybacking, and hacking are examples of such fraud techniques. So masquerading involves a perpetrator gaining access to the system from a remote site by pretending to be an authorized user. So this technique usually requires first gaining authorized access to a password. Next is piggybacking, is a technique in which the perpetrator at a remote site taps into the telecommunications lines and latches onto an authorized user who is logging into the system. So once in the system, the perpetrator can masquerade as the authorized user. So note that hacking may involve piggybacking or masquerading techniques. Lastly, hackers. Hackers are distinguished from other computer criminals because their motives are not usually to defraud for financial gain. So some are motivated primarily by the challenge of breaking into the system rather than the theft of assets. So nevertheless, hackers have caused extensive damage and loss to organizations. Next, please. So for the second stage of the information system, data processing. So once collected, data usually require processing to produce information. Tasks in the data processing stage range from simple to complex. So examples include mathematical algorithms such as linear programming models used for production scheduling applications, statistical techniques for sales forecasting, and posting and summarizing procedures used for accounting applications. So data processing frauds fall into two classes, which is the program fraud and operations fraud. So the program fraud includes the following techniques: creating illegal programs that can access data files to alter, delete, or insert values into accounting records. Second is destroying or corrupting a program's logic using a computer virus. And lastly, altering program logic to cause the application to process data incorrectly. So for example, ani guys is kanang a program nga naa sa bank na ginagamit nila nga to calculate interest on its customers' accounts. So in this case, natin gitawag program fraud called the salami fraud, which involves modifying the rounding logic of the program. So it no longer adds the 1 cent randomly. So instead, the modified program always adds the +cent to the perpetrator's account, but still adds the -cent randomly. So this can divert a considerable amount of cash to the perpetrator, but the accounting records stay in balance to conceal the crime. So the second class is operations fraud. So it is the misuse or theft of the firm's computer resources. This often involves using the computer to conduct personal business. So for example, a CPA in the controller's office may use the company's computer to prepare tax returns and financial statements for her private clients. So next, please. So the next stage is the database management. So the organization's database is its physical repository for financial and non-financial data. Database management fraud includes altering, deleting, corrupting, destroying, or stealing an organization's data. Because access to database files is an essential element of this fraud, it is often associated with transaction or program fraud. So a common fraud technique is to access the database from a remote site and browse the files for useful information that can be copied and sold to competitors. So another method is to insert a destructive routine called a logic bomb into a program. At a specified time or when certain conditions are met, the logic bomb erases the data files that the program accesses. So for example, naay disgruntled programmer who is contemplating leaving the organization. So ang programmer, pwede siya mag-insert og logic bomb into the payroll system. So weeks later nga, ang system iyang ma-detect nga ang programmer, ang iyang name dito sa payroll system kay nawala na, so pasabot mo wala na siya sa company or sa organization. Then if ma-detect na siya sa system, the logic bomb is activated and erases the entire payroll file. So that would be the database management. Next, please. So we are now at the last stage of the information system, information generation. So information generation is the process of compiling, arranging, formatting, and presenting information to users. Information may be an operational document such as sales order, a structured report, or a message on a computer screen. So regardless of physical form, useful information has the following characteristics. So relevance, timeliness, accuracy, completeness, and summarization. So relevance. The contents of a report or document must serve a purpose. This could be to support a manager's decision or a clerk's task. We have established that only data relevant to a user's action have information content. Therefore, the information system should present only relevant data in its reports. Second one is timeliness. The age of information is a critical factor in determining its usefulness. That is why information must be no older than the time period of the action it supports. So for example is, if a manager makes decisions daily to purchase inventory from a supplier based upon an inventory status report, then the information in the report should be no more than a day old kay daily man gamake og decision ang manager. Next one is accuracy. Information must be free from material errors. So material error exists when the amount of inaccuracy in information causes the user to make poor decisions or to fail to make necessary decisions. So often, perfect information is not available within the decision time frame of the user. That is why we sometimes must sacrifice absolute accuracy to obtain timely information. Therefore, in providing information, system designers seek a balance between information that is as accurate as possible, yet timely enough to be useful. Next is completeness. So no piece of information essential to a decision or task should be missing. So for example, a report should provide all necessary calculations of an account para maka-assess sa katong mga managers nga galantaw atong nga report. So summarization, which is the last characteristic of useful information. So information should be aggregated in accordance with a user's needs. Lower level managers tend to need information that is highly detailed. As information flows upward through the organization to top management, it becomes more summarized. So later in this reporting, we shall look more closely at the effects that organizational structure and managerial level have on information reporting. Next, please. So a common form of fraud at the information generation stage is to steal, misdirect, or misuse computer output. So one simple but effective fraud technique is called scavenging. It involves searching through the trash cans of the computer center for discarded output. So an example ani is kanang nagprint ang manager og output reports, then naay nasayop like misaligned ang iyang text or nahugaw ang iyang paper or nakrumpled. So, ang may tabo ani is, so, kay hugaw mo to siya, ilabog to siya ni manager. Then, ang perpetrator dayon is, maka-obtain din siya sa useful nga information gamit atong gilabog nga kuan nga paper. So, another form of fraud called eavesdropping, which involves listening to output transmissions over telecommunications lines. So technologies are readily available that enable perpetrators to intercept messages being sent over unprotected telephone lines and microwave channels. So most experts agree that it is practically impossible to prevent a determined perpetrator from accessing data communication channels. However, data encryption can render useless any data captured through eavesdropping. So, encryption gani guys is katong conversion of data from a readable format to kaning code para di siya madali og basa. So that ends my part, computer fraud and the 4 fraud schemes. So the next reporter will be Mr. Malinaw.
So good afternoon, everyone. I am Michael Benz Malinaw, and I will be talking about the auditor's responsibility for detecting fraud. So the current authoritative guidelines on fraud detection are presented in SAS number 99, Consideration of Fraud in a Financial Statement Audit. The auditor must think of fraud in every phase of the audit processes and seamlessly blend the auditor's consideration of fraud into the audit process. The auditor is also required to assess the risk factors related to both fraudulent financial reporting and misappropriation of assets. So next slide, please. So first is we need to talk about the fraudulent financial reporting. So fraudulent financial reporting, as mentioned earlier, is the intentional misrepresentation of a firm's financial statements with the aim to give investors a mistaken impression about the firm's operating performance and profitability. So these are the risk factors that relate to fraudulent financial reporting, and they are grouped according to the following classifications. So first is the management's characteristics and influence over the control environment. Second is industry conditions, and third is operating characteristics and financial stability. So in management's characteristics and influence over the control environment, these factors relate to the tone at the top regarding internal control, management style, situational pressures, and financial reporting processes of the organization. Next is the industry conditions, and this includes the economic and regulatory environment in which the entity operates. For example, a company in a declining industry or with key customers experiencing business failures is at greater risk to fraud than one whose industry base is stable. And lastly, the operating characteristics and financial stability. This pertains to the nature of the entity and the complexity of its business transactions. For example, an organization involved with related party transactions with organizations that are not audited may be at risk to fraud. Next slide, please. John, hello. Next is the misappropriation, fraudulent financial reporting continuation. In case of financial fraud or management fraud, external auditors should look for the following kinds of common schemes. So these are the common schemes of financial fraud that the auditor should look for. So first is improper revenue recognition, improper treatment of sales, improper deferral of costs and expenses, improper recording of liabilities, and inadequate disclosures. So next slide, please. Next is the misappropriation of assets. Misappropriation of assets means that the theft of an entity's assets that causes the financial statements not to be presented in conformity with generally accepted accounting principles. Misappropriation of assets includes false or misleading records or documents, possibly created by circumventing controls. So there are two risk factors that relates to the misappropriation of assets. First is the susceptibility of asset misappropriation. The susceptibility of an asset pertains to its nature and the degree to which it is subject to theft. So liquid assets such as cash, bonds, are more susceptible, bearer bonds are more susceptible to misappropriation than non-liquid assets such as property, plant, and equipment. So second is controls. These class of risk factors involve the inadequacy or lack of controls designed to prevent or detect misappropriation of assets. For example, a database management system that does not adequately restrict access to accounting records increases the risk of asset misappropriation. Here are some examples of common schemes related to employee theft or asset misappropriation. First is personal purchases, ghost employees, fictitious expenses, altered pay, pass-through vendors, theft of cash or inventory, and lapping. The next slide, please. Next is the auditor's response to risk assessment. The auditor's judgment about the risk of material misstatements due to fraud may affect the audit in the following ways: engagement, staffing, and extent of supervision. So the knowledge, skill, and ability of personnel assigned to the engagement should be commensurate with the assessment of the level of risk of the engagement. Second is professional skepticism. Professional skepticism involves maintaining an attitude that includes a questioning mind and a critical assessment of the audit evidence. Next is nature, timing, and extent of performed procedures. Fraud risk factors that have control implications may limit the auditor's ability to assess control risk below the maximum and thus reduce substantive testing. Next slide, please. Response to detected misstatements due to fraud. To some degree, the risk of material misstatement due to fraud always exists. So, dili man jud natin siya malikayan kay for people man pod. The auditor's response is thus influenced by the degree of assessed risk. So in some cases, the auditor may determine that currently planned audit procedures are sufficient to respond to the risk factors. But in other cases, the auditor may decide to extend the audit and modify planned procedures. And in rare instances, the auditor may conclude that the procedures cannot be sufficiently modified to address the risk, and in which case the auditor should consider withdrawing from the engagement and communicating the reasons for withdrawal to the audit committee. So when the auditor has determined that fraud exists but had no material effect on the financial statements, the auditor should refer to an appropriate level management to at least one level above those involved. And next is be satisfied that implications for other aspects of the audit have been adequately considered. Next slide, please. When the fraud has had material effect on the financial statements or the auditor is unable to evaluate its degree of materiality, the auditor should do the following. First is to consider the implications for other aspects of the audit. Second is to discuss the matter with senior management and with the board of directors audit committee. Third is to attempt to determine whether fraud is material. And lastly is to suggest that the client consult with legal counsel if appropriate. Next slide, please. Last responsibility is the documentation requirements. So the auditor should document in the working papers the criteria used for assessing the fraud risk factors. Where risk factors are identified, the documentation should include those risk factors identified and the auditor's response to them. So that ends my report, and the next reporter will be Ms. Rhea Horia.
Okay, I think
Hello, sir.
yes.
Okay lang ba nga i-play na ko ang iyang report, sir?
Um, ano na lang. Since time naman, I think I'll just upload it sa sa classwork so that the class can watch na lang sa yung report.
Okay, sir.
Since it's 2:30 naman, medyo taas pa na, ano? 10 minutes. So, is that okay?
Yes, sir.
Sige. Okay, so just to add na sa ito with regards to uh, responsibilities of an auditor with regards to fraud. Again, no, we must check yun kung material ba ang atang nakita nga fraud. Some auditors, they maintain na we have no responsibility to detect fraud. So, ang atang responsibility is the detection of misstatement in the financial statements. So, if that fraud does misstate the financial statement, then I think that's part of our responsibility. But of course, no, when it is material good, then as mentioned kanina, we need to address it to the appropriate level of management or appropriate level of someone nga nasa position. Um, One example that I've experienced is that in the expenses of the company that we were auditing, there was a representation expense. So this representation expense kay ginagamit ni siya for mga meetings, mga planning slash outing sa mga management and directors. But we saw a large amount yun sa representation expense na makabatingala mi nga for planning, meeting, kani kadako. And it was found out na katudayng amount was used to pay for the salary of a manager or consulting manager nga dili na siya pwede ma-employed tungod kay retired na siya. So di nila pwede himuon siya nga as salary expense because um kato nga manager is already retired, nagadawat na siya og pension. So if mugawas to nga salary niya, then that is not allowed in the law. So kadto, even though I did find out kadto nga findings, since staff mo kato no, ang task ato na is to address it first to my senior, and then my senior siya na dayon ang address to the management. So I didn't really know what was the outcome of that sa ilahang resolution ato, because there was an exit conference in which the auditors along with the owners and the managers will discuss mga findings. So dili immediately na mo conclude nga naa nay fraud tungod lang ato. But it can be. It may be a red flag. So ito, fraud must be material for it to be valid, no, nga kuan na to raise an issue. Okay, so since time naman, so again, please check the report sa isa ka reporter, video ni Miss Juriel. I'll be uploading it along with this recording. And also, reminder na sa katong gingon kanina about sa white paper. Start and searching how to prepare a white paper. And I will upload later or tomorrow siguro the topics. Then, in the i-comment dayon sa inyong group unsa nga topic inyong pilion. So, first group to choose the topic will get that topic. Okay. So, sa pa ba? Reminder. Yes, there's a question. Okay. And please, submit your PowerPoint presentation and your short quiz so that I can upload it and also prepare the quiz. So, any question?
Sir, pwede pa again atong mamili mig topic, sir, kay choppy sa akong end to, sir.
Okay. You will be preparing a white paper and then I will, up, post 15 topics na pwede niyo pilian and yun na i-comment down dito sa classwork ang topic na inyong i-choose. So, the first group to choose that topic will have that. Sila yung, so dili pwede magpareho og topic. So, paunahan na og pili og topic once I post it in the classwork. Okay.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Sige, so if there are no more questions, since time naman, thank you for joining our class today and class is dismissed.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, reporters. Bye po.
Thank you, sir.
Bye, sir.